I certainly do think that those gains that people had, like the boomers had, like after 1945, are 100% worth fighting for, because people had better lives. people
Yeah,
just
yeah,
had people just had better lives, had more secure lives, and I think we
Yeah.
have everything we need now to basically make a better world. And I think it's feasible. It's entirely feasible that we move away from, because even the mode of capitalism at the moment is so insane. Like it's like it's so parasitic and based on like rentierism. I would have thought that we would have been able to form like a coalition between like aspects of organized labor and like almost like productive national capitalists.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Happy to be joined by contributing editor Leigh Phillips. Hi, Leigh. And also by our guest this evening, Dan Evans. And Dan is a writer, an academic based in South Wales, and is the author of A Nation of Shopkeepers, The Unstoppable Rise of the Petty Bourgeoisie. Dan, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on, guys.
Yeah, well, really, I think this is much delayed follow-up to a previous episode, which is episode 349, with yourself and me and Catherine Liu talking about class. And that is indeed what we'll be talking about again this evening. So mainly discussing, Dan, your piece from November of last year in the New Socialist, Is the Working Class Back? ? And we'll probably give an answer to that question, or at least hopefully start to. And this piece starts with, workers have structural power as the strike wave of 2022 demonstrated, but the working class remains weak and fragmented, and its politics are increasingly chaotic. What is to be done? Very good question. And this is also something, to give a plug, that we are looking at in the third section of the reading club, which is going to be about class in the 21st century. So before we discuss the piece, just wanted to wind back a little bit to the book, your book that I mentioned, A Nation of Shopkeepers, which, as I said, we discussed with Catherine in the summer of 2023. And listeners can go back and look at that, give that episode a listen. But could you maybe, just for listeners who haven't heard that episode, or just to catch everyone up, what is the kind of main thesis of the book, the kind of new petty bourgeoisie that you talk about in the book?
Sure thing. That was a really great event, by the way, in London. It was awesome.
It was good. It was very hot, though.
It also feels like a total lifetime ago.
Yeah.
In many ways, like since then, I've obviously had a child, got a new job, quit alcohol. So everything's changed in my life since then. But yeah, so the book, I mean, it's a bit of a mouthful now. I sort of, now you have to talk about it a lot. You think, should I have just gone with a snappier title, or just gone with just A Nation of Shopkeepers? But yeah, it's about, broadly speaking, the low middle classes. And the reason I decided to write the book, I mean, well, there's a bunch of reasons. I mean, going all the way back, my PhD was an ethnography of like Welsh national identity and social class in my hometown. And I sort of started out with these quite crude binary categories of like working class versus middle class. And then by the end of the PhD, I'd sort of stumbled across all like the stuff about the petty bourgeoisie, but I didn't really like develop it at all. Then, a lot of stuff happens, left academia. And then I think the main thing that got me thinking about it was obviously Brexit happens. And by that, and at the time Brexit happens, I'm working in Cardiff University. And I just got the sense that, like, amongst like the liberal sort of commentariat and, or even the people I knew in Cardiff University, there was this real horror about like people who were voting to leave, and indeed, people who vote Conservative. And obviously I was like, well, this is like really the milieu that I've grown up in, this sort of low middle class experience. Almost everyone in this place, in this town, voted and votes Conservative, and everyone in my Facebook, old friends are voting to leave. So I just thought, I didn't really like the tone that people were using about places like where I came from. And I just thought if I can sort of tease this out a bit, I think it'll explain not just Brexit, but like a lot of things in British politics, because I felt that the way class is talked about within British journalism was so unhelpful and obscured often a lot more than it sort of clarified, in particular when it comes to talking about, the Red Wall or left behind regions, or, the Rust Belt or whatever they call it in America. And, this idea that it's the working class that are driving, right-wing authoritarianism or like right-wing populism, when actually pretty much all the political science data suggests that the main pillar of these movements, including like Trumpism and now, Reform, Brexit, AFD, Le Pen, it's largely like small business owners. So that's the context. And then the book, the main thesis of the book, I guess, really is that the petty bourgeoisie or the low middle classes have sort of grown from a small, because the classic, if you're going all the way back, I guess the classic Marxist take, or say Marxist take, like as in Marx himself, it says in the manifesto that the petty bourgeoisie is probably going to collapse, destroyed by monopoly capital, and then the small producer is going to sink into the ranks of the proletariat. He did say a lot of other stuff afterwards, which sort of contradicted that and suggested that he thought it was going to be a bit more durable. But the general consensus, he said it was going to collapse. But if you look at the broad history, of the 20th century, and particularly since like Thatcherism, it's actually, the small businesses or small self-employed, i.e. the petty bourgeoisie, have massively expanded to the point where just before COVID in the UK, it was, I think it was, over 5 million people, which is nearly the size of the entire public sector in the UK. So it was a huge chunk of the workforce. So it was talking about this group and their sort of habitus, their culture, their politics. And then, I mean, I've done this joke to death, so apologies for your listeners, but like I categorize the petty bourgeoisie as like, it's like a DNA double helix, so it's got two strands. And I don't know anything about DNA, but it was just the only thing I could think of which had like two things. I guess you could use like a yin and a yang. So they have the old petty bourgeoisie, which I class as a small solo self-employed. So, people who have got their own business without any employees. And that can be, the tradesman, it used to be like the small shopkeeper, the butcher, baker, candlestick maker, like artisan. But obviously today there's a huge diversity in that section, enormous. And it's like, personal trainers, people selling like Herbalife online. You've got like rise of the gig economy. So there's this grey area between, are people self-employed, are they employees? So I dig into that. And then I class this other fraction, which are called a new petty bourgeoisie, which following Nikos Palantzas, I categorize as essentially downwardly mobile white collar workers or graduates, which is now again a huge swathe of the population. I can't actually remember how many. I'll have to double check. I think it's around 4 million or something like that. Something crazy graduates in the UK who are working in non-graduate roles. But obviously, in the book they were like a placeholder for like the sprawling proletarianized white collar middle class. And then I spent a lot of time in the book talking about like how they're similar, how they're different, based on Palantzas. And this group, whereas the old petty bourgeoisie have sort of tended to break right politically and forming the basis of, right populist movements across the world, this new petty bourgeoisie, this sort of like downwardly mobile graduate cohort, they have formed the nucleus of, the new left movement. So Corbyn, Podemos, Syriza, Bernie Sanders. So, there's been like a bit of a misconception on both sides, because I think, those movements were definitely not working class movements. Equally, Trumpism and things like that, they're generally not working class revolts movements either. So I think there's been like a bit of ventriloquism going on about like, who makes up these movements. So basically saying that, you have to really go back and understand like the theory of this class. And there's a lot out there, and their internal life if you want to understand modern politics. And that's particularly the case, I say, in the UK, purely because Margaret Thatcher, who obviously embodies neoliberalism in the UK, she was like almost like the dictionary definition of a petty bourgeois, and like in the 70s and 80s when she's being profiled for like the New York Times and things like that, there's all these people in her cabinet basically saying, she's from this class, dad's a greengrocer, she grew up working in this shop. These are her people. She understands their worldview, their desires absolutely intimately. And Thatcherism as a movement in the UK, as a huge radical cultural movement, is about really making the values and worldview of the petty bourgeoisie, of the small trader, hegemonic in the UK. And I think it really succeeded in that. And yet, despite this ideology being everywhere, like values of thrift, a dislike of like bureaucracy, dislike of monopoly capital, but equally almost like a visceral hatred of the scrounger or the underclass.
Very much so. Yeah.
So that for me, like it really, you can't really understand British politics without this. But there wasn't anything that I could see that discussed it. So that's a really, really convoluted, long-winded way of saying that is why I wrote the book, and that's what it's about.
No, I think it's really helpful. I think we often talk about the PMC, and I kind of want to trail that kind of part. Discussion about the intermediate classes or the middle classes to the reading club. And I actually should say thank you for recommending even some of the texts that we're going to be reading in that section of the reading club. But I think this recognition that there is this new petty bourgeoisie, this professional managerial class, there is a new kind of intermediate class, and they play an important role in politics. But we'll come to that later, because we want to go back to the original question, which is about the working class. Like, is the working class back? And obviously this article is specifically about the UK, but exactly, hearing you explain kind of all that stuff about the new petty bourgeoisie, I think, Britain is a pretty good case study, which applies to a lot of Western Europe and North America, if not further than that. But yeah, so I did want to start with a question about definitions, or like how important are definitions? Because a lot of the time we kind of hear about working class, and then not to just pile on too much to Guardian journalists, because that's a bit passé now, but there is a whole multi-level discourse about what is working class, who is working class, what do you need to do to prove your credentials here, there, or wherever. But yeah, what would in terms of this article, or in terms of answering the question, is the working class back? How would you define working class? Is the definition important?
Yeah, well, nice small question, but
yeah, sorry.
no, it basically, I mean, I'd probably write a different book, if I was writing it today. And like, I think I was looking back at the book, I'm sort of in between two worlds, like one is like I was outside of academia when I was writing it. So I was like, working with the homeless and sort of writing it part-time, when I wasn't on shift and stuff. And I think if I'd written it again now, being back in academia, it probably would have been very different. Like, not least because you have access to like journal articles and stuff, when I didn't before. I was just getting people to send me them via email. And then the other world is like, this like Marxist quote unquote world that I thought I was like in, growing up like on the left. And then there's like the sociology like world. And I can get into that a bit more, but like, one of the things I've noticed most since writing the book is just, particularly by some of the reviews and the reactions to it, is how deeply attached people are to the category and the identity of working class. And this is particularly the case, I would suggest, in like this like downwardly mobile like graduate cohort. People have really invested in the idea that like we are the sort of vanguard of the proletariat, like we are the working class. People have got these whole spiels, about like, I'm an academic labourer, like this weird, like, and I saw someone on Twitter the other day basically like, what's the value in this? Like, what? Who cares? And one of the things I actually wanted to do with the book was like move class away from like moral categories and just say, well, like, I don't really think they're particularly helpful. I don't think it's really particularly helpful to view class in like moral terms. And I don't see like, but obviously people do see the working class as like this moral category. And just for more context, in the UK, there's a book out by Sam Friedman. And and Aaron Reeves, and it's about basically the mass misrecognition of like class position in the UK. So like every single person in the UK, I mean, Leigh will probably say this apparently is different in America where most people want to be middle class, but in the UK, like everyone wants to be working class. Everyone like identifies as working class. And in their book, they're talking about like, people who went to private school, people who like work in the city, people with huge amounts of like money identifying as working class because it's seen as it's largely in the UK seen as a cultural category or something that you inherit. So like I'm working class because my granddad worked down the mine. And obviously there's a degree of like people do this because it's a way of justifying this like meritocrat. They have their own meritocratic narrative of their own life. I didn't get, if you could say working class culturally, I didn't get a leg up, things like that. You can overlook maybe the advantages you've had. I don't like to use the word privilege, but maybe you can overlook or ignore the structural advantages you've had in the economy, and you just call yourself working class, etc. So there's a huge amount of like confusion about the term working class, and as I discussed in the start of the book, particularly like in British liberal journalism, and I think this is probably because there's such a massive gulf between journalists who by and large go to elite schools and like the rest of the population. They think like anyone who's got like a regional accent is like working class. And in the UK, they define working class almost overwhelmingly culturally. And that's why you have this ridiculous position where, you've got millionaires like Alan Sugar, Charlie Mullin, all these people who are they're still considered working class because they've got working class accents. So your class never changes, etc. So there's huge amounts of like confusion about it. And then I realized in the book that I've written about like the working class as like a foil. I don't really talk about the working class. I just talk about them in relation to, the petty bourgeoisie are not the working class. But the funny thing is, even since I wrote a book basically saying about my petty bourgeois upbringing and like my petty bourgeois values, I have people who clearly think that I'm sort of claiming to be like working class. It's all very like, it's all bizarre. But in terms of like definitions, do I think definitions are like important? So I think one of the first, I was talking about this on Twitter today, but one of the most interesting things I think is that I was reading as soon as I finished writing my book, I read this Mike Davis book called Old Gods, New Masters, which is just an unbelievable book. And like in all my early book launches, I was just basically wasn't talking about my book. I was talking about this book by Mike Davis, and in which he basically says, well, what is the working class and what makes it special? And I think one of the things I've taken from that book is that there's a distinction, or I think there should be a distinction between the working class as like a cultural category on the one hand, and then the proletariat as in Marx's agent of history, the gravedigger of capitalism, this agent that is going to, overthrow this status quo and is going to change society and, inherit the earth, etc., etc. Because when people talk about the working class, I think it's just so vague. It's so vague sometimes that it just can be totally meaningless, and it can mean a bunch of different things. Like, well, is there a working class like culture or like set of behaviors and things? I would argue that, well, yeah, obviously there is. There are working class places. The working class used to have their own cultural and associational life, working men's clubs. The blue collar jobs. Mining, steel working, the legacy of which is still extremely tangible in South Wales. There are certain things that you grow up. There are certain behaviours and norms that you grow up. If you grow up in these areas that you sort of absorb, you like certain sports. You like football generally, you like boxing, things like that. So there's obviously like this big thing, and like there's loads of books, about working class cultural life. Like The Uses of Literacy by Richard Hogarth. It exists. Working class culture exists. Working class places exist. But then again, if you want to talk about like what the proletariat is, then I think this book by Mike Davis like really drills down into it and what makes the proletariat special. And I think I talked about this a bit with Matt Huber because like I think it only when people get upset about being called like not the working class, like I've got the stage now where I'm like, if you want to identify as like working class, like that's absolutely fine. If you think like, if you're like a graduate and you've been to Oxbridge, and you've got all this huge amount of cultural capital, but if you want to say that you're working class, that's fine. I don't really care. Like I'm not going to do it, but in terms of like are you the agent that's gonna like change society? And I think if we look at like these left movements, Corbynism, Sanders, Podemos, and stuff like that, they've got huge structural weaknesses because they are not the agent of history. They're totally chaotic in their politics. Like, you have to look at the fragmentation of Corbynism around Brexit, the fact that like the cohort of young graduates, like basically, got with like Starmer and things like that to force him to pivot to abandon the correct position on Brexit. And that was because of like, various cultural things. But what I argue in the book is that the way that that class in power and in politics behaves totally chaotically in a way that the old petty bourgeoisie does as well. So it's like, so Mike Davis basically has his checklist of what makes the proletariat. And like one is like genuinely the sort of, they work collectively. This is alluded to in Marx, in like, if you, in the manifesto, that they work in larger workplaces, they feel their power more and more. They have like beefs with each other, but then gradually they sort of work out that there's stronger collectively. They organize themselves into institutions like trade unions, and then they come together. So it's not really explicitly said, what it is and what makes it special in Marx. So Davis says you have to sort of come together, bring together these fragments to assume. And the one is this collective, almost like this, it's almost like a je ne sais quoi, like they're coming together in collective large workplaces, and they're acting collectively. Second is their associations, in that they have like, generally speaking, they have like things like not just a cultural life, but they have collective institutions like trade unions, which are generally speaking were more militant than white collar trade unions. Like throughout the 20th century, if you read like White Collar by C. Wright Mills, it's all about it's all about the fact that like white collar unions were like really insipid, and they were like ideologically didn't want to kick off because they were too close to the bosses and things like that. And this stuff has happened. It's not like an abstract idea. If you look at the history of like trade union organizing, blue collar trade union leaders are always like, how do we organize the clerks and like the shop workers, because they're so close ideologically to the bosses. That sort of stuff disappeared into the ether now. So there's
just to jump in here, because I'm aware I asked you like possibly one of the most difficult questions, but I think that's a really good answer, that these kind of political definitions of class have in general been kind of moved to one side in favor of either kind of cultural or sociological, or more like individualized ones, and that's always going to lead to some confusion, and I think some capital D discourse. But one of the things you were saying about the workplace and material changes made me think, Leigh, you had because I was going to ask another one of these like massive questions, which is probably unanswerable, about how the working class went away. But I think that you had a more like on the nose like way to kind of put this.
Yeah, I mean, in your essay, you talk a lot about the disappearance of mass politics, of these mass parties, and the shrinking of union density. And in fact, I think I've got a quote here actually: "Work and social life," and this is along the lines of what Mike Davis is writing about. Work and social life fragmenting into isolated bubbles, much of the workforce is becoming harder to organize, and the capacity for class consciousness and coherent action as a collective is declining. Even in our remaining huge workplaces, for example, Amazon warehouses, the workforce is transient and vulnerable, and hence the noble efforts to organize these sectors have thus come to nothing. Now, my worry, and I hope this isn't true, but my worry is that this sort of ruling the void, planet of slums, sort of bowling alone, although I suppose bowling alone is a bit more of a sort of liberal take on the same phenomenon, looking at sort of decline of civic engagement. How much of this is actually unavoidable, this atomization? How is it possible anymore to organize against this, if so much of the historic left organizing assumed large workplaces, large civil organizations, mass parties? What elements of this are just a product of deindustrialization, and we're just not going back? and how much of it is also sort of technologically constrained. I mean, even as into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, television was this deeply atomizing novel technology, and today, of course, we have much more than that. We have the internet, video games, streaming services, algorithms that are designed for addiction, online dating, even sort of like online gambling. And do we just have to accept that there is no going back to this old mode of organizing? In your essay, you do seem a little bit pessimistic that we can, and that we need new forms of organizing.
Yeah. So obviously in the essay, I mean, it comes back to what we were just talking about, proletarianization. If proletarianization was the process really of workers working in larger collective workplaces, like in industrialization, factories, then the process of deindustrialization, which is what we're seeing all around the world, because I think the period is analogous now to that strange period just before industrialization, where you have like the semi-proletariat, you have people, the cottage industries and the putting out system and things like that. So this period, so we're going backwards. So a lot of sociologists and anthropologists say that, Davis says that this is essentially a process of deproletarianization, meaning, as you said, Leigh, people working in more and more isolated, individualized conditions, which makes collectivism a lot harder. Bowling alone being a classic example. And like, I sort of oscillate between like massive pessimism and like huge optimism. In terms of pessimism, like, to start with, like, what I think is crazy is how many people are like absolutely obsessed with working from home. And like, whenever I say work from home is bad on like Twitter, people are just like, you're a fascist, you're a nutter, things like that. Oh, you agree with capital, like you want, and it's like, no, I want, like, funny enough, I think like working on your own is like extremely isolating. It's one of the reasons like trade union density has like fallen off a cliff. And it does, it makes it, I mean, you speak to any trade union organizer and they'll say, especially in like a white collar or like a mixed collar workplace, it's really difficult to bring people together. It's really difficult to do anything in person. Like, we had a union event like before Christmas, and I think like 2 people showed up. But people are just used to doing stuff online, and it is really difficult. It is really difficult to organize. And as you say, a lot of it has been driven by tech, by remote work. And like, it's work, and people working remotely are basically like managed a lot of the times by algorithms. And it's not just the case in white collar workplaces. Obviously, delivery drivers and things like that are governed by an algorithm, or algorithmic control, and they're working in extremely fragmented, isolated working conditions, even though there's been a degree of like fetishization of their like revolutionary potential on sections of the left of like delivery drivers. But generally speaking, like, a lot of the ethnographic work on organizing like Deliveroo drivers and stuff shows that even the strategies of resistance that are employed, they're pretty individualistic. So there is like this almost like culture of solipsism, which necessarily emerges, I think, from these new atomized conditions. And I tried to tease this out in the book to say, even if you disagree with me about, whether or not people are like technically the petty bourgeoisie or whatever, can we at least discuss the fact that more and more people are in these isolated conditions? And it's those isolated conditions historically which drove the chaotic politics of the petty bourgeoisie, because it was anger, but it wasn't collectivized. So they sort of were seen to lack the discipline of the proletariat. So there is this like pessimism, and like part of me thinks like, do we have to be really happy when like a big business forces everyone back into the office, because it's like, oh great, now we can sort of come together. And I don't necessarily think that's right. Yeah, sorry.
Can I just push you a little bit on this, because I think your kind of ambivalence, I definitely share it. And in the piece, you talk about these kind of individualized modes of resistance, quitting, sickness, walking off jobs, and it seems like these kind of fit the current material conditions. Like, if everything is more atomized, then why wouldn't the kind of the response or the resistance to that be also more individualized? But I guess my I need to try and put this in a coherent way, because something which I've tried to think through and write a little bit about is this idea that E.P. Thompson has, that class struggle precedes classes, that you end up you form collective actors in the process of struggle, and often against a class which is in the process of creation as well. So is there a way that these kind of individualized kind of forms of resistance will kind of show their own limitations and then lead to the necessity for more kind of collective forms of resistance? Or is that just kind of wishful thinking that suddenly quiet quitting is going to qualitatively, the quantity is going to become quality, and people are not going to quiet quit, they're going to loudly quit and then loudly take over their workplaces? I mean, am I on something here, or is this?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's a possibility. But the positive thing I was going to say to follow up to Leigh's question as well is, like, if I'd written the book now, I mean, like, thinking about what, obviously I've had like nearly 2 years to sort of reflect on like what the petty bourgeoisie are, like what makes the working class special, and thinking about Mike Davis's idea, like almost the what does he call it, like the scorecard or whatever for the working class, and makes them revolutionary and radical. Like, I would sort of double down, and I actually think that if you look at the broad history of of the world, or like industrial unrest and revolution, I honestly think it's actually the petty bourgeoisie who are the most like oppositional and radical class. Like, almost like if you go back to like the Chartists, the Levelers, the Luddites, national liberation movements in the global South, even like the Russian Revolution, like the Cuban Revolution. I mean, there's loads. I mean, the anarchist movement in like the Narodniks and things like that. These were not. None of them were led by what we'd now think of the proletariat. They were all led by like artisans. They were all led by the petty bourgeoisie, like almost. And the early socialism that Marx was talking about, like, this is a really radical class, and none of them are working in like these collective, large factories. And to play devil's advocate, you could say that like actually the tendency, when you have like the ideal conditions, the ideal like proletariat, let's say like from the start of the late 19th century to like the start of the 20th century, middle half. In fact, the tendency is actually being towards like trade union consciousness and like compromise with capital, because the trade union bureaucracy that grows up like out of those conditions, rather than being like a revolutionary agent, is tended to be a dampener on rank and file class consciousness. So it's not to say that the individual proletariat like wasn't revolutionary or didn't have like amazing perfect class consciousness, but their institutions, particularly the unions, I think have a structural tendency to compromise. Whereas the earlier, like this period, all the periods of like, as I said, the Chartists and the Levelers and you got the swing riots, the Luddites. You can go through like British history in particular, and probably like even like probably like American history. I don't know anything about it, but in France and across Europe, the small artisans they're the ones who actually tend to smash the system up. And yeah, like Marx and Engels criticize them because they never actually go all the way. They always sort of compromise or whatever, because they do have stuff to lose. They have some status, they have small property, so they don't want to have like a communistic socialist society. But if you actually look at the checklist of like who are the people who were like kicking off and smashing up the place and like opposition, and being a real threat, it's almost always like the petty bourgeoisie. So I'm far more optimistic now, I think, because I think that we have got this situation, which is like chaos, essentially. We've still got people who are really angry and pissed off, and they're not like disciplined. They don't have like perfect politics. Most people have like very chaotic politics if you speak to them. But if you just speak to the most people are so angry that I think that and if you look at the majority of like the protests that are threatening the state across Europe now, they're petty bourgeois in character. You got the Gilets Jaunes, the Dutch farmers protest, the farmers protest, and the truckers protest in like Canada. They're almost this is the new radical or dangerous class. The difference is they're not protesting in the way that the left are used to. They don't have like coherent, perfect socialist politics.
Yeah.
there's something interesting there. Certainly, the discussion around the Gilets jaunes, the farmers' protests in Europe, the truckers, and absolutely, there's a very strong sort of petty bourgeois element, especially to the farmers and the truckers. Although the truckers themselves, part of the sort of petty bourgeois aspect to them is the offloading of the ownership of the truck itself and associated to the driver from the traditionally larger companies. And even though they now have a sort of mixed consciousness in terms of they're still absolutely blue collar workers driving these very, very long, very if anything, even more supervised sort of work environments than before, particularly with technology. In fact, that was one of the reasons why they were so pissed off, was that the impositions around the vaccination and so on and so forth was just yet another level of supervision. That it was the straw that broke the camel's back. At the same time, I mean, I think that just to revisit why it was that Marx and other Marxists emphasized the importance of the working class. It wasn't so much that there was any expectation that the working class was more revolutionary or kicked things off more. It was that Marx's understanding what was capitalism. It was a process of commodity production, i.e., markets, and that exploitation, the exploitation of workers, was downstream of that commodity production. And so the working class had an interest in getting rid of commodity production. But once you get rid of commodity production, the only way that you can allocate things that are necessary in society, you have to do it in a democratic way. You have to the sort of free association producers. Well, that's economic planning by any other name. And once you have that, you don't merely liberate yourself, your own little class. You liberate all of humanity. You get rid of capitalism entirely. And this is why Marx and those who came after him were critical of the peasantry in particular, or students, or the petty bourgeoisie. Not that they didn't have revolutionary potential, but because when they finished their kicking offness, if you will, and they achieved some gain, that was it. They solved their issue. They were not a universal class in the way that the working class was. And this is why, if it is the case that all that we are left with is the sort of the DNA, that the sort of two elements of downwardly mobile middle class graduates and the petty bourgeoisie, I worry that is insufficient with respect to the grand transformation that would be necessary to truly liberate all of humanity.
Oh, for sure. I can't remember the phrase that Davis uses when he talks about, he says like that it's, or maybe it's Gauze, in Farewell to the Working Class, but by virtue of their own sort of total helplessness and almost like extreme poverty and the fact they don't own anything. I can't remember the word, but the working class, that's why it has to become the gravedigger, like you said. And as I say in the book, is that the phrase "the working class have nothing left to lose but their chains" makes sense more when you realize that Marx and Engels are contrasting it to failed petty bourgeois revolutions in Germany, and that class does have something to lose, has small property. And as you said, it's not going to transition to a non-capitalist society. It's going to continue small commodity production. And often the reason they're kicking off is not because they're against capital per se, it's just because they're against monopoly capitalism. But I guess what I wanted to say when I was looking at the trade union movement in the UK is that, the traditional then, or the old working class, if we're going to talk about that, it really is, I think, objectively, especially in the West, it is shrinking, in terms of the organized working class. Trade unionism is, the density is tanking. Trade union density is massively concentrated amongst professionals. You're more likely to be in a trade union if you have a master's degree, if you earn a lot more money. You're more likely to be a trade unionist if you're a manager than a worker at this stage. So there's large, there's not to say there's not larger workplaces, because there are huge workplaces, particularly Amazon warehouses, but and JD Sports Direct warehouses and all this sort of stuff. But people are like, so it's all, the way that they've been organized makes it almost literally impossible for people to come together. There's no associational life. There's no trade unions.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't, and like, so I wanted to, I think one of the reasons I wrote about the organized labor being on the not on the, I think because I just thought some of the crazy optimism and like of the Corbyn era was just coming up to the surface again during the strike wave. Like people were calling for a general strike. They wanted, we're going to storm the Winter Palace, and you want to say like, hold your horses. Like this is still like massively defensive, and in fact, I was following very closely for my job, the postal workers strike. I've just got an article about that coming up soon in Work, Employment and Society, and this is the postal workers is a good way of like testing, I think, the temperature, gauging the strength of the labour movement in the UK. This is easily, I'd say, the most militant union in the UK. I mean, they were called the miners of the 90s. Every other trade union adopted like the new realism and moved towards like compromise and partnership. The posties generally had like a pretty militant like organising culture. And if you go to some of these depots, like I was in Cardiff, you've got people like, I came away from like hanging out with these guys in the picket line. I'm like, well, do you know what? If there is a proletariat today, it's these guys, multiracial, multi-religious, like working class autodidacts, people who are like incredibly switched on, incredibly militant, like very culturally working class, have been on strike a number of times, like have an amazing understanding of the stakes, of how to organize. And yet they essentially got destroyed because you have open union busting by the Royal Mail all the way through the year. Well, reps were being suspended, people were being bullied, people were being suspended without pay, people were being fired. And at the end of that year, they sort of accepted a deal which they would never have accepted like a year before. Royal Mail basically threatened to de-recognise the CWU. And if you look at any post on like Twitter or Facebook by like Dave Ward or the CW top brass, you will see thousands or hundreds of like very upset postal workers in the main who are like extremely pissed off about the settlement. But even worse, I thought, was this process almost akin to a blood transfusion, where at the end of the strike, all these guys, and they were like in their 50s, a lot of them, or like even late 50s, who've been on working for like 35 years sometimes, they just left. They were just like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I've had enough. Like, not you win, but like, it's a very physically demanding job. They're doing like 20,000, 30,000 steps a day in all weather, they left. And what happens is you have a new cohort of younger people coming in on worse contracts, a younger generation who've only ever known working for Amazon or working for Deliveroo or whatever, who don't really know even what a trade union is. So on paper, these people are like, the proletariat or whatever, but like in terms of that like culture and that mindset, whatever, it's in danger of being totally lost. So the class consciousness, and where like maybe that can be like built back up, but then like I said back then that higher education, for example, which I'm in now, capital, like the universities, like it was obvious during that strike that we were so weak, we had such little leverage, that the universities are just going to do whatever they wanted at some stage. And that's exactly what's happening now. There's mass layoffs. The government aren't going to step in. There's nothing we can do because we've got no leverage either. It's just happened in the steelworks by me. So like blue collar workers and white collar workers, again, absolutely screwed. And the union movement is so weak. And like, so I don't know, I just think we're so far away from like this ideal like proletariat. We're so far away from like, a revolutionary situation. We're so far away, even like it would take like 50, maybe 100 years to get to the same level of constant organizing, to get to the same levels of like union density and like militancy in like the 30s and 40s. So
yeah, no, I think this kind of need for realism comes through in the piece. I just wanted to offer some quick clarifications for international listeners on some of the references, and then pass over to Leigh for a question about whether, if the working, should we even defend all these kind of working class, white male achievements? So Alan Sugar is the British equivalent to Donald Trump. He presents the Apprentice in the UK. Sports Direct is a manufacturer of massive mugs, some sports products as well. This is one actually just for the British listeners. And a postie is somebody who delivers mail. I don't know if that's an international thing, a Canadian thing as well, Leigh, or not. You'll have to tell us. But yeah, you had a question, Leigh, about so this makes it sound like you're wanting to ask Dan whether all this stuff should be, should we be sad that these, should we be nostalgic for these achievements of the so-called Labour movement? Anyway, but yeah, I'll stop saying what your question is and pass it to you to actually ask it.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think I don't disagree with your diagnosis. I think, and I along with what George was saying, I think there's a desperate need for some realism rather than just, as you were saying, you've got a minor uptick and suddenly everybody's calling for a general strike, with no forces behind you to be able to pull off something like that. There's another analyst in the United States, Gabriel Winant. I don't know if you've read his stuff on his book, The Next Shift. I'm quite critical of the book, but I want to steelman his argument. Gabriel Winant's argument in The Next Shift is that the industrial working class and its post-war gains are not really perhaps worth defending, that there was actually a lot of sort of racist, sexist, and extractivist sort of elements to the post-war welfare state consensus, and that any sort of defense of the industrial working class is an exercise in just social chauvinist nostalgia. And so we can't go back to this anyway due to industrialization. So he has a similar sort of pessimistic analysis of the state of play of the industrial working class. And he argues that instead, the future front in the class struggle, he doesn't argue for the sort of the petty bourgeoisie or the new petty bourgeoisie, but instead that this future front in the class struggle is in services like healthcare and education in particular, which are often sort of gendered and racialized. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that argument compares to your own pessimism about the class. My own concern about this is that it relegates, even if it is true that the industrial working class is, as a revolutionary force is done and dusted. I don't know if that's necessary. I'm not convinced that that's the case. Although, however pessimistic and realistic we need to be, that does that not relegate the class struggle just to the public sector? So we're abandoning any sort of conflict between capital and labor, and now the struggle is only over, well, how much can we force the government to tax the private sector?
Yeah, so I don't want to. Obviously, I actually referenced The Next Shift in the book, but in terms of the sort of moral arguments he makes, I wouldn't want to comment so much on them. I mean, I think he's right to say that, I use him to support the descriptive analysis that, the working class has been decomposed, and it's not, it's no longer necessarily all, white men working in manufacturing, and it is multiracial, it is in services, it's particularly in America, it's, ethnic minorities working in low-paid, non-unionized service work. I should say that obviously there is still, I think there is a danger sometimes of going too far in one direction, like I probably done in this interview. There is still a core of the traditional working class working in manufacturing or other blue collar work. Until very recently, thousands and thousands of people in South Wales were working in steel production. Still, a lot of people I know were working in steel production or in car manufacturing plants in the Ford. Now in a couple of years, Ford and Tata Steel have shut down. But I think we can say, we can overstate what's happening. Although with what's about to happen in Grangemouth in the UK, and then what's happened with the Vauxhall plant in Luton, Winant's thesis is going to become more and more true, that there isn't this old white working class, like whatever. Although, I mean, I think that's very much an American thing. Let's just be honest, the UK is like an overwhelmingly white country, so there's the racial element I just don't think applies as much. Now, across Europe, to the extent that like all the data suggests that like this shrinking old traditional working class overwhelmingly votes for the populist right. So that, I mean, I don't know whether that means that we should abandon that group. Like, obviously, I don't think we should. In terms of like who the agent of change is, like the reason I think the petty bourgeoisie is the most radical, just because I think if you look at their sort of what's happening, it just seems to me to be like they often seem to be the most oppositional. They're the ones who are most oppositional vis-a-vis monopoly capital. They're the ones who are most oppositional vis-a-vis the state bureaucracy. I think like a lot of the stuff around Brexit was like really oppositional. So like, I don't really like buy this idea that this new, like, multiracial, like working class in the service industry is going to be the new like agent of change, just because, I mean, in the same way that like I read a lot of stuff, especially in like the field of like, the labor process, and people are just obsessed almost with like Deliveroo drivers, which is, essentially like the new lumpen proletariat, this ultra marginalized, like, often migrant workers, and people are really like basically saying they're going to be like the new agent of change. And I personally just don't buy it. I don't think the conditions are there. It's not saying they're like not, it's nothing to do with them as individuals. I just don't think this is where change is going to come from. I think most of these new workplaces are like ununionized. Like, it's incredibly difficult to like organize people in these new in like the service sector. Although the caveat, interestingly, when I was looking at days lost in the last strike wave, they interviewed like a bunch of like people. I can't remember the name of the survey, but they essentially said that the school strikes would be more disruptive than rail strikes, because school strikes have a knock-on effect of parents having to leave work to go and do childcare. So you could argue that like teachers in particular do have a huge amount of leverage, like,
yeah.
And like, so I'm not saying they're not like a revolutionary agent, but I don't know if this necessarily answers the question, Lee, but like in terms of the welfare state, like I'm 40 now, and like I'm a bit like Eric Olin, right? Like, we're not going to overthrow capitalism in my lifetime. Like, we're not going to have anything. The absolute best case scenario I can envision is no longer, like the communist utopia I thought it was going to be like when I was, 20 or even 30. Like, I just don't think that's going to happen. Like, the best case scenario I think in my lifetime genuinely is some form of something analogous to the post-war welfare state. Now, whether that was underpinned by like colonialism or, extractivism or like racism, like I think you can make an argument either way. But I think in terms of like the material of the idea for people who are living in this country, and people who are living in like America, for example, like the best thing we can all come together and to do now is to try to come up with is to build a union movement, or to just build whatever grassroots movement in order to force a series of concessions from capital with like a new left populist government. And like, because I guess the ideal scenario would be some form of like nationally productive capitalism with like very high growth, and then a total rebooting of the welfare state system. So we have like universal childcare, universal healthcare, etc., and all the stuff that's being sort of stripped back under austerity. I think that's the best case scenario, based being a realist. So I don't think, like, I certainly do think that those gains that people had, like the boomers had, like after 1945, are 100% worth fighting for, because people had better lives. People just had better lives, had more secure lives, and I think we have everything we need now to basically make a better world. And I think it's feasible. It's entirely feasible that we move away from, because even the mode of capitalism at the moment is so insane. Like it's like it's so parasitic and based on like rentierism. I would have thought that we would have been able to form like a coalition between like aspects of organized labor and like almost like productive national capitalists, a la like Ricardo, people who want to move away from like this parasite vulture capitalism and like which is obsessed with like financialization, and we can move towards like a national economy which like makes stuff. But that's I don't know if that answers it. I don't know if that answers it at all. But I think like a question at all. But I don't think we're going to get anything better than the post-war welfare state. So I certainly back in the day I made that same argument. It was racist. It was based on colonialism. But now it's like,
yeah, it's a
like, you know, I'd absolutely like that's the best we're gonna get. That's the absolute best we're ever gonna get. Like,
so
so
that's. I mean, I would say that's a nice note to leave it on, but it's an extremely pessimistic one, or maybe a realist one. So maybe a quick final question about like, because actually, Leigh, you had this one
I
as
wanted
well
to ask about
on
the Just Stop Oil.
yeah, because I think this is one of the kind of the questions which I think you alluded to, Dan, is like who's gonna what are the movements, what are the like who can we actually look to in, you know, if we are talking about the PMC being more radical, you know, those where's that going to come from? But anyway, Leigh.
Yeah, I guess I mean one of the reasons that I am quite critical of the PMC. I mean, again, I don't really like that term, but the Brahmin left, or however we want to describe it, we know what we're talking about. Is that I feel that there is a deep disconnect from this classic industrial working class, and the area that I write a lot about is climate change, energy systems, and the industrial working class still exists in energy, still exists in transport, still exists in manufacturing, and the very front lines of decarbonization. And the unions in those sectors, they do still exist. And they are enormously critical of groups like Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, People Not Planet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the response on some parts of the left, particularly the Green left, is, well, these unions are just they're union bureaucracies, they're on the side of capital, they're ignorant. And in fact, I would say it's actually quite the reverse, that the Just Stop Oils, the Extinction Rebellions, in their it's not merely that I disagree with their tactics, like their radical tactics stopping working class people getting to work on a publicly owned, electrically powered public transport system, but that their goals are bonkers. That they're opposite, and the industrial unions tend to oppose them because their opposition to nuclear power, their opposition to carbon capture and storage, against fracking, which is necessary for advanced geothermal, and so on and so forth. So I feel that the reason that the Green left has emerged is with these sort of bonkers positions that are irrational from a decarbonization perspective, is simply because they're disconnected from that industrial working class. The industrial working class can tell them, if there was still this discipline of mass trade unions and the left connected to the industrial working class, there would be that social weight, that's discipline, that tacit and formal knowledge of industrial systems that would feed into the intellectual classes, or the intellectuals within the left. Instead, they're cut off from that. They simply don't know that if you don't have, just to use one example, firm dispatchable electricity, the grid falls apart. And so they can have these crazy flights of fancy with respect to that. But that's also true with respect to defund the police or abolish prisons, or any number of these crazy slogans that we've seen in the last few years. And so I really do want to sort of try to reconnect the left to that industrial working class. In your essay, and I love so much of your analysis. I really, really do. But what sort of struck me, sort of stopped me cold there, was your suggestion that some of these new groups, like Just Stop Oil, are these, because of their radicality, that they potentially are a new revolutionary side. Maybe you don't go quite that far, but maybe you could unpick that a little bit for me.
Sure. Yeah, like I have I can't use the word schizoid, like an oscillating view of like groups like Just Stop Oil. So I think on the one hand, I think what I was saying was their willingness to make sacrifices to break the law, I think is extremely noble, and like I have a huge amount of respect for some of these young people for making the sacrifices they are making and like willing to go to prison and so on. And I was contrasting that with like, the sort of timidity of the trade union bureaucracy, particularly in the UK, who aren't willing to really like push the boundaries. So there's that. Now, in terms of what you're saying, I mean, it's funny because it actually gets to one of the other, and I think we've ticked all Mike Davis's like checklist off now in terms of like what makes the working class a working class. And one of them is like the polytechnic ability, as in we actually need, these are the people who actually run the vital stuff that you need to keep society moving. And like obviously Matt Huber talks about that as well, as it like, you need energy workers because they know how to run the country. They make it, you need these people because they can make like wind turbines, they can run like nuclear plants and things like that, and we can't. Well, I can't anyway. So they have like this polytechnic quality that will, and you need, and obviously in terms, as you said, in terms of their like enormous leverage, as you said, that the traditional working class does definitely exist in the energy sector. And I do think there's this crazy discourse whereby people think that people are going to like willingly vote for, their jobs to become extinct, or they're going to be warm towards anyone who sort of like, basically says we need to get rid of X, Y, or Z. And this is where I just think we need like absolute realism. Now, obviously, what's happening in the UK at the moment is that, before Labour got in, there was this big thing like, it has to be, if there's a green transition, it has to be jobs led. We're not going to lose any jobs as part of like decarbonisation. Instead, what's happened now, the mass layoffs of, steel workers, there's going to be oil refinery workers, mass layoffs of car workers as we move to electric vehicles. So decarbonisation and net zero, unfortunately for the green movement, is already overwhelmingly being experienced as A, job losses, B, things like ULEZ in London, like the sort of the campaign for sort of high emissions vehicles are going to be taxed more. So it's experiences like essentially a tax on the poorest people.
Yeah.
And you have this crazy dynamic where often, like, the left, or people I see on Twitter at least, are like, good, like you should be taxing the ULEZ, and you just tearing your hair out, or like, I would if I had any, like just saying like, no, but like if this stuff is going to be experienced as, either a top-down bureaucratic imposition that makes your life more inconvenient, or even worse, it's going to be experiences like job losses, then you're never going to get some form, you're never going to get any support for like the green transition. And like, I do think that, strategically moving forward, like one of the biggest things to be done is to bring together like the red and the green, like the trade union movement and aspects of like the environmental movement. And like, there are some, to be fair to Just Stop Oil, like I'm in contact with a lot of the people there, and they are, very alert to this perception of themselves, and they are consciously trying to build links between them and the union movement. So there's a thing going on at the moment called the campaign for like heat strike, which is about, how can workers, in the trade union movement agree to, safe working conditions in like heat or extreme weather and things like that. So there's a way of trying to bring together like, real workers, blue collar workers, and, lefty, let's quote unquote PMC campaigners. So they are really trying, I think. But obviously, in terms of the points of tension, as you say, like it's the points of tension are fairly obvious. I've sort of transitioned from someone who was fairly pro degrowth, I think, to now someone who would probably be classed as like an eco-modernist. And that goes back to what I was just saying about the fact that I think that the best case scenario is some form of like, welfare state with, high growth, which we're going to need like more energy for. I don't think that's necessarily incompatible with like, being greener or being nicer to the planet. But I don't think people have really factored in like what a green transition would look like. You can't just say to people like, okay, you just consume less, or, we can't just focus on individual behaviors. So as you said, like, as you said, Leigh, as Matt Huber said, you can't do any of this stuff without getting blue collar workers in the energy sector on board. And you can't just make people, well, you can make people redundant. I guess that's what they're doing. But I think the answer is we need a massive we do need a huge green industrial strategy.
Yeah.
And that would presumably hit everyone's needs or our needs on the left, in that it would keep this organized working class in work. It would keep these collective workplaces, so class consciousness, and it would facilitate a green transition. But this is going to involve like massive transformations of like land, huge amounts of huge amounts of production in order to make the things that you need to like retrofit houses and like wind turbines, and then there's going to be massive debates about land use, solar farms and wind farms and so on. And again, we're so far away from doing that at the moment. It's actually crazy. Like like they closed down the Ford plant in Bridgend, and they're closing down the steelworks in Talbot, and like there's nothing approaching like a Lucas plan. No one, like we wrote a letter to the Welsh government saying like, rather than just shut this the Ford plant down, why not at least try to like transition it into a state-run EV plant, or even better, why not transition it to a plant which is making like wind turbine blades or things like that for like a state-owned energy company. And the political will just isn't there. And I don't know if that doesn't like answer I think any of what you're saying, but like I basically have a mixed view of like, I think we can be too harsh sometimes on the activists, like the green activists left, but like they're obviously not like the this. It's a great example of where the working class has to be like the vanguard of any change.
So I think
I don't think there's a sensible strategy to engage them at all.
No, I think this is probably a well needed corrective to take a more kind of nuanced approach sometimes than we do on this podcast towards perhaps green activists who, for my own part, I have maybe not applied the sort of, I guess, the class analysis that you were laying out there, Dan. And obviously this is, not the final word on whether the working class is back or how to combine green and red by using blue collar. I mean, if that is even possible. But, thanks so much for joining us, Dan. And really great chat.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.